September 11th, 1941. 6:17 a.m. The morning mist over Bridgeport, Connecticut, smelled of coal smoke and stagnant river water. As the first freight cars groaned to a halt at the siding of the Remington Arms Complex, they carried a cargo that felt more like an archaeological find than a modern war effort. Massive wooden crates, stained with decades of dampness and grease, were pried open to reveal a ghost. Inside lay the tooling from the Rock Island arsenal, lathes, drill presses, and gauges that had been mothballed since the end of the Great War in 1919. They were covered in hardened cosmoline and packed in sawdust that had turned grey with age. These machines hadn't produced a single rifle in 22 years. They were relics of the Woodrow Wilson era, designed for a slower time, a more gentlemanly form of manufacturing. But as the crates were cracked open, the world was anything but slow. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, the fires of total war were already licking the shores of democracy, and America was waking up to a terrifying reality. Its arsenal was empty. The Remington factory in Bridgeport wasn't just another building. It was an industrial titan spanning 73 acres. Since 1867, its chimneys had blackened the sky, and during World War I, it was heralded by the New York Times as the greatest small arms plant on the planet. But by late 1941, it was a sleeping giant. The US military had a desperate problem. They had adopted the M1 Garand, the magnificent semi-automatic future of infantry warfare, but the future was stuck in a bottleneck. Production at Springfield and Winchester was a trickle compared to the tidal wave of soldiers being drafted. The Army looked at its stockpiles and saw aging M19903 Springfields with worn barrels and receivers that were dangerously brittle from improper heat treatment decades ago. They needed a bridge between the past and an uncertain future. On that very morning, September 11th, the government handed Remington a contract that would change everything: $134,000 M19903 rifles. This wasn't just an order, it was a race against the clock. The British had just seen their own massive rifle contracts cancelled due to the shifting tides of Lend-Lease. America was now arming itself first. The engineers at Remington looked at the rusted Rock Island tooling and knew they were facing an impossible task. They had 2 months to calibrate, refurbish, and ignite a production line for a bolt-action rifle that the world thought was obsolete. They weren't just building guns, they were resurrecting a legend to stand in the gap where the modern world had failed. The Remington Arms Complex wasn't just a factory, it was a sovereign city of steel spanning 38 buildings and over 650,000 square feet of industrial muscle. By late 1941, this city was undergoing a silent, radical transformation. As the draft boards drained Bridgeport of its young men, the assembly lines didn't stop. They changed faces. Thousands of women, some who had never stepped foot inside an industrial plant, walked through the gates to reclaim the machines of their fathers and brothers. The air inside the complex was a heavy, suffocating blanket of cutting oil, gun bluing, and the metallic tang of lead dust. It was a world of 12-hour shifts, where the sun was a memory and the rhythm of the drill press was the only clock that mattered. These women weren't just replacements, they were precision instruments. They operated massive lathes, calibrated receivers to within 1/1000th of an inch, and inspected firing pins with a vigilance that the military's own officers found staggering. In the heat treatment rooms, where the air shimmered with the intense glow of furnaces, Men and women worked together to bake strength into the steel of the M19903 receivers. A delicate dance of fire and timing where a single degree of error could result in a rifle that would shatter like glass in a soldier's hands. But the urgency of 1941 carried a brutal price. The Remington plant had a dark history written in blood and cordite. Decades earlier, in 1905, and again during the Great War, massive explosions had torn through the buildings, sending bullets flying into the surrounding neighborhoods and leaving families to mourn in the shadow of the shot tower. The danger hadn't disappeared. It had only changed shape. The workers inhaled lead dust that seeped into their lungs and faced the constant threat of fingers crushed in high-pressure hydraulic presses. Yet, the line never faltered. By November 1941, the first batch of 1,273 rifles rolled off the line. They were beautiful anomalies, walnut stocks hand-fitted with finger grooves, metal polished to a near-mirror Parkerized finish. They were works of craftsmanship, legacies of the old Rock Island standards. But as the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor on December 7th, beauty became a luxury the world could no longer afford. The contract for 134,000 rifles suddenly exploded into a demand for 308,000, then 500,000. The target was no longer craftsmanship, it was volume. 2,000 rifles a day. The women of Bridgeport weren't just making song anymore. They were forging a massive, unstoppable iron wave to counter the darkness of the Axis powers. As 1942 dawned, the Ordnance Department arrived at Bridgeport with a verdict that felt like an insult to the old guard of gunsmiths. Stop making jewellery and start making weapons. The early M103s coming off Remington's line were masterpieces, hand-polished, finely machined, and fitted with the care of a Swiss watch. But a masterpiece takes time, and time was a currency the Allied forces were spending in blood at Bataan and North Africa. The mandate was clear. Speed was more vital than aesthetics. Remington's engineers began a radical piece-by-piece deconstruction of the Springfield rifle. This was the birth of the modified M103, a transitional ghost in the history of firearms. They started by stripping away the non-essential. The mirror-like polish was replaced by a rough, utilitarian grey. The labour-intensive machining of small parts was abandoned in favour of a revolutionary technology for the time, stamped steel. The upper barrel band, once a forged piece of art that required hours of milling, was replaced by a simple piece of metal, bent into shape and welded. The floor plate, the trigger guard, and even the butt plate followed suit, stamped out of sheets of steel in seconds by high-pressure presses. But the real revolution happened on May 21st, 1942, when the M19903A3 was officially standardized. This was no longer your grandfather's Springfield. The complex leaf sight, which required a soldier to have the eyes of a hawk and the patience of a saint, was scrapped. In its place, a simple aperture peep sight was mounted directly onto the receiver bridge, closer to the soldier's eye. It was faster, more intuitive, and far cheaper to produce. The beautiful walnut stocks lost their elegant finger grooves, becoming smooth, blunt tools of war. Even the rifling inside the barrel was cut from 4 grooves, down to 2 in many cases, a move that traditionalists screamed would ruin accuracy. But in reality, at combat distances, the difference was negligible. The factory floor became a thundering rhythm of good enough. The smell of cutting oil and the scream of lathes filled the air 24 hours a day, 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Every 8 seconds, another receiver was stamped. Every minute, a dozen barrels were mated to their actions. To the purist, the M1903A3 looked crude, almost ugly, with its stamped metal and rough tool marks. But to the Army, it was a miracle of logistics. Production plummeted from hours per rifle to minutes. By mid-1942, Remington was churning out 40,000 rifles a month. They weren't just building a weapon, they were building a bridge of steel to keep the infantry alive until the M1 Garand could finally take the lead. It was the triumph of industrial utility over the pride of the craftsman. December 16th, 1944. 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes forest was a cathedral of frozen pine and suffocating silence until the earth itself began to scream. 20 German divisions, a steel tide of 200,000 men, smashed into the thin American lines. This was the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allies. At the centre of this storm was a small crossroads town called Bastogne, and in the frozen foxholes surrounding that town, the M1903A3, the rifle they said was obsolete, was about to prove that old and simple meant alive. The men of the 101st Airborne and the 10th Armoured Division were surrounded, outgunned and freezing. In temperatures that dropped well below zero, the high-tech weapons of the era began to fail. The M1 Garand, for all its semi-automatic brilliance, was a complex machine of gas ports and internal springs. When the mud froze into iron and the sleet turned to ice inside the action, the Garand could become a very expensive club. But the Remington-made M1903A3 was a different beast. It was a bolt-action relic, a manual machine of brute force. Imagine a 19-year-old soldier, his fingers so black with frostbite he can barely feel the trigger. He doesn't have an M1 Garand. He's an engineer or a scout, and he's carrying a Remington with a serial number in the 3 million range, a rifle built by a woman in Bridgeport who had never seen snow this deep. When the German Volksgrenadiers charge through the fog, he doesn't need a gas system to work. He needs a bolt that he can kick open with the heel of his boot if he has to. He needs a rifle that will fire every time he pulls the trigger, regardless of the ice coating the receiver. The M1903A3 didn't need specialized clips. It could be fed single rounds by shaking hands. Its simplified peep sight didn't clog with snow as easily as the old leaf sights. In the desperate perimeter of Bastogne, where General McAuliffe gave his famous one-word answer, "Nuts," to the German demand for surrender, the Remington Springfields were there. They were in the hands of the men who held the line when the tanks ran out of fuel and the planes couldn't fly. These rifles weren't elegant, and they weren't the future, but in the white hell of the Ardennes, they were the ultimate insurance policy. The women in Connecticut had built these machines with a quota in mind, but for the soldiers at Bastogne, those 12-hour shifts in Bridgeport were the difference between a broken line and a miracle. February 1944. The last M19903A3 rolled off the line in Bridgeport, was stamped with its final inspection mark, and disappeared into a shipping crate. The serial numbers had climbed past the 4 million mark. In just over 2 years, Remington had performed a miracle of industrial alchemy, manufacturing over 1 million rifles, using machines that were supposed to be in a museum. The gap had been filled. The M1 Garand was finally being produced in sufficient numbers, and the era of the bolt-action infantry rifle was drawing to a close. But for the factory in Bridgeport, the end of the war was the beginning of a long, slow goodbye. The 14,800 workers who had lived and breathed the rhythm of the M1903 drifted back to civilian life. The women who had mastered the art of the hydraulic press and the precision gauge returned to their homes. their hands scarred, and their hearing dulled by the unrelenting roar of production. They didn't get a parade. They got a final paycheck and a quiet walk out of the gate. The Remington complex, once the greatest small arms plant in the world, began to shrink. Decades passed, and the 73-acre titan of industry was slowly devoured by time and neglect. In 1986, the gates closed for the last time. Today, if you drive through Bridgeport, you won't find the 38 buildings that once hummed with the urgency of a nation at war. They have been razed, replaced by empty lots and the indifferent growth of weeds. Only the 190-foot shot tower remains, a lonely brick sentinel watching over a ghost. Yet the legacy of Bridgeport isn't in the rubble, it's in the steel. Thousands of Remington-made Springfields survived the war. They came home in the duffel bags of soldiers. They were sold as surplus to hunters, and they were issued to National Guard units for decades. When you hold a rifle stamped with Remington on the receiver and RA on the barrel, you aren't just holding a firearm. You're holding a piece of 12-hour shifts, a piece of the solvent-filled air of Connecticut, and a piece of the grit that held the line at Bastogne. The M1903A3 wasn't the most advanced weapon of World War II. It was plain, it was stamped, and it was rough. But in the grand calculus of victory, it proved a fundamental truth. Capacity is a weapon of its own. The ability of a free people to turn old tools into modern salvation is what won the war. The soldiers at Bastogne didn't care that their rifles were obsolete. They cared that they worked. And as long as one of these rifles remains, the story of the workers in Bridgeport, the people who built the tools of survival, will never truly be forgotten.